Hey everybody, welcome back to Game Esoterica series Ridge Evolution. It's a hard word to say, but it's an arcade racing retrospective on the entire Ridge Racer franchise. And if you can't tell already, today we're playing the original Ridge Racer on PlayStation 1, and while we are amplifying the hell out of the graphics with Duckstation, this was a launch title in all three regions, North America, Japan, and Europe, and it brought home the promise of 3D gaming into your living room. This is still an incredible game today, even though it hasn't aged as well as some of the other PlayStation 1 games that were in 3D, but for a launch title is absolutely spectacular. Before I get too far involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. Now, I remember getting Ridge Racer for Christmas with my PlayStation 1, and I had played the game in arcades. Seeing this running in my living room as a kid was absolutely mind-blowing. It really did feel like I just had the arcade original at home. Now, that is not true whatsoever. This is definitely a huge graphical downgrade compared to the Namco System 22, but what it lacks in that hardware brute forcing, it makes up for in actually being real 3D that you could play in your living room when PlayStation 1 came out. Because the launch library was not huge and there weren't a ton of 3D games, seeing this running on your CRT television in the 90s felt nothing short of magic. And while it isn't as graphically impressive as the arcade original, all of the driving, all of the controls, all of the intensity translate extremely well over to the PlayStation 1. Now unfortunately it did take a frame rate hit. This is running at 30 frames per second, not 60, but I will show you some 60 frame per second gameplay footage later on in the video, because a version of this game did release that did up the frame rate when developers got better with PlayStation 1 hardware. But this is the type of game, this is when they were just figuring out how 3D worked. And as we move back over to an original capture here with no enhancements on whatsoever, this is what you saw when you plugged your PlayStation 1 in around Christmas morning in 1995 and started playing Ridge Racer. And even though this is completely inferior to the Duckstation enhancements, this is still so impressive. 1995 was a very long time ago, and the idea that you could play this at home, something you saw in arcades, was just such a fun time. Obviously, you know, we had the Sega Saturn ports of different games as well, but there was something extra special about Ridge Racer being on PlayStation 1 at launch. The entire game came over, it just didn't look as good, but back then we probably didn't even notice. We weren't used to pixel peeping different versions of different games. And this is still one of the best racing games on PlayStation 1. Obviously it's beaten by stuff like R4, but the fact that this was a day one game still is wild because it's that fun. And basically the developers at Namco had to recreate the game from the ground up because the Namco System 22 is absolutely nothing like the PlayStation 1 whatsoever. So the fact that not only did the developers make an excellent port, but they got it out for the launch in Japan is just such an accomplishment. This was, and I'm sure, not an easy task to try to pivot an arcade classic to a brand new home console that Sony basically whole cloth had made up, never having made hardware before in the gaming space. And it is still a pretty game. I do love all of the chunky polygons and the pixels. I even love the texture warping here and there. I know some people love to turn perspective correct textures on so you don't get that warping, but it is part and parcel of what the PlayStation 1 hardware looked like, and it does give me those nostalgic vibes. And like every other Ridge Racer game, I still prefer to race in the cockpit view because I feel like in third-person mode I just hit the wall way too often. But this just felt so fast. We really hadn't seen 3D move at this clip in the 90s. Sure, we had stuff like Need for Speed on the 3DO, but that, while impressive, just didn't feel as fast. Now, of course, it is just a Ridge Racer game, so you're only going to get a handful of tracks, and that was definitely a disappointment when this came home. It was impressive from a technological perspective, but when you actually sat down and played the game, you realized you had seen everything it could do in like the first 20 minutes, and that was a little bit of a letdown. I understand launch titles are never the most impressive thing as far as length are concerned, but Ridge Racer definitely left you feeling like, now what am I going to play next? You could keep coming back and racing the same two courses over and over again, but trust me, back in 1995, that definitely did get old. But what didn't get old is just the sensation of fun you could have with this game and the absolute banger of a soundtrack. Go ahead and get 45 seconds of that and I'll come back and tell you more about the game.
Next corner stop! Watch yourself!
To the intensity of the soundtrack, to the reverb when you're in a tunnel, to the tires screeching and the engine noises, I would say the soundscape to Ridge Racer on PlayStation 1 still holds up to this day as some of the most impressive sound mixing I have ever heard. You get to hear everything, the music comes through, the sound effects come through, it is the entire audioscape, and it is balanced absolutely incredibly, so big marks to the audio engineers that worked on this game for getting that done. You will see that I'm bouncing off a few walls here, and that is because I played the arcade original first and this one second, which can be very difficult to do. When you're losing those 30 frames a second, things do feel ever so slightly different, and that's the reality of Ridge Racer. If you actually play them back to back, arcade versus the PlayStation 1 version, you will notice some slight handling differences. They aren't that big whatsoever, it just can be tricky to play them side by side. But this is what you got in the arcades before the game came out on PlayStation 1, and I would say that while this is obviously more impressive, the fact that they were able to get this running on PlayStation 1 is still a great accomplishment. This was highly technical hardware for the year of release. Namco System 22 was very bespoke silicon, and that can be very difficult to translate over to the home market. Think of Sega with all of their Model 2 games that they tried to bring to the Sega Saturn. They are all still fun, but they are huge graphical downgrades compared to the Sega Model 2 platform. Obviously the same thing was always destined to happen with System 22 down to PlayStation 1, but when you can take something like this game running on Namco System 22 hardware with all the different texture filtering and all of the stable polygons, bring it over to the PlayStation 1 and still have it look pretty, you've done a damn fine job. And the best part is, with something like Duckstation, you can get 16:9 support out of this, you can get perspective correct textures, everything can be patched up, and it does feel like a really fun modern version of the game, and that is always a good thing. And that's why I love emulation sometimes, because I understand you maybe don't want to go back to the original Ridge Racer on PlayStation 1, but you do want to still continue to experience it. Something like Duckstation keeps these games alive because yes, 1995 was a long time ago, and not every single game from that era aged well. But the great thing about something like Ridge Racer is you can't age the track design. This is flawless design. There's so many great corners, so many good straightaways, tunnels, everything you would want out of an arcade racing game is here, except 60 frames a second, but hey, Namco actually brought that to us with a bonus disc in R4. Now there is a small caveat, they couldn't do 60 frames per second while drawing all the opponent cars on the screen as well, so you basically just have time trial and time attack mode. But if you can see here, if you're watching this in the 60 frame per second version on YouTube, the game is much more fluid now, and that is just down to the developers and engineers at Namco getting better with the PlayStation 1 hardware and understanding how they could actually get 60 frames per second out of a game like this. And the best part is the original Ridge Racer is also on this demo disc. Just be aware it's the iteration that was the original PlayStation 1 version, so that's going to still run at 30 frames per second. But just seeing this run in 60 frames, seeing the fluidity is so much fun. But I'm going to give you one more taste of the soundtrack as I bounce around the course here. Again, I don't know what it is about third person mode, but this is a completely different vibe on this music, so go ahead and listen for 30 seconds, and I'll be right back. Such good music there, and remember, if you want to modernize this even more, Ridge Racer on the PlayStation Portable, the original release, has a complete remake of this course. Yes, it definitely changes the vibes, the colorways are completely different, but it is a more modern version of the game to play if you don't want to play the PlayStation 1 original. And I love that Namco keeps revisiting this one track. In the beginning of the series, I feel like maybe they went back to a little bit too much, but when so many years had gone by when we get to the PlayStation Portable, seeing the original track from the original Ridge Racer running in such better fidelity is absolutely a fun time. As we pop back over to the PlayStation 1 original right here through the same tunnel, this is just an absolute classic game. Not only does it still hold up, not only is it still fun, it basically showed us what the future of home console gaming was going to be when this came out. Now 3DO was no slouch when it came to 3D, but PlayStation 1 could just run things faster, and when you saw this running in your living room, you realized that you were in for year after year after year of amazing 3D game. And it's wild to think that this game right here ends up becoming R4 on the PlayStation 1. The amount of years that went past were not that many, but the difference in these two games is vast, and that was the entire PlayStation 1 generation in a nutshell. What we got at the beginning was wildly different than what we saw at the end, but this is still a Hall of Fame first ballot good game. If you've never played the PlayStation 1 original, I can't recommend you check it out enough. But we're done here, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.